My drone captured an incredible sight, a massive Bigfoot village hidden in national forest. I never thought I would be the person to stumble onto something like this. My name doesn't matter, but what happened to me last October in the Pacific Northwest absolutely does. I'm a recreational drone pilot and hobby photographer, nothing special, just someone who likes capturing beautiful landscapes for my portfolio. What started as a simple search for waterfall shots turned into the most terrifying 2 weeks of my life. I saw things that shouldn't exist, lived among creatures that science claims are myths, and barely escaped with my sanity intact. This is my story. Every word is true. I'm sharing it because people need to know what's really out there in those remote forests where nobody goes. The government knows, the park rangers know, and now you're about to know too. It was early morning in late October when I drove out to a remote section of national forest I had never explored before. A coworker mentioned there was a spectacular waterfall hidden somewhere in that area, perfect for the kind of scenic photography I love. The fog was still hanging heavy in the valleys when I arrived, giving everything an eerie, dreamlike quality. I parked at an old logging road turnout and looked around. Not a single other vehicle for miles. Just me, my truck, and thousands of acres of untouched wilderness. I've flown my drone dozens of times in various forests across the Pacific Northwest. Never seen anything unusual, just trees, rivers, wildlife doing their thing. This time felt different from the start, though I couldn't put my finger on why. Maybe it was the silence, no birds singing, no squirrels chattering, just an oppressive quiet that made the hair on my neck stand up. I set up my gear in the clearing and launched the drone. The little machine buzzed up and over the tree line, its camera feed streaming to my controller screen. I started scanning for the waterfall, flying deeper into the forest than I had originally planned. The battery gauge showed 60% when something caught my eye through the camera feed. About 2 miles in, where there definitely shouldn't be any clearings according to my maps, I spotted what looked like an open area. At first, I assumed it was an old logging camp or maybe a ranger station. The Forest Service maintains dozens of small outposts in these remote areas. But as I flew the drone closer, something felt off about the shape and layout. I decided to investigate before heading to the waterfall. That decision changed everything. As the drone approached the clearing, the camera feed started revealing details that made my hands shake. This wasn't a logging camp. I could see multiple crude structures made from logs and branches arranged in a circular pattern like some kind of village layout. The structures were massive, way too big for humans. Some were dome-shaped, others were lean-to style, all constructed with what looked like expert precision. I counted roughly 15 to 20 structures in the clearing. In the center sat what appeared to be a communal fire pit, surrounded by logs arranged as seating. The whole scene looked like something from an anthropology textbook about primitive cultures, except the scale was completely wrong. Everything was enormous. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was a survival training camp, some kind of primitive skills workshop. People do pay good money for that kind of experience. But something about it didn't add up. There were no vehicles nearby, no modern equipment, nothing to suggest this was a commercial operation. And those structures were huge, built to accommodate people who would have to be 8 or 9 feet tall. I lowered the drone's altitude to get a better view, bringing it down to about 30 feet above the village. The camera revealed even more disturbing details. The structures weren't just thrown together, they were expertly woven, with branches interlaced in complex patterns that showed real skill and planning. Outside several structures, I could see large animal hides stretched on wooden frames, drying in the morning air. There were drying racks with what looked like fish or meat hanging from them. Carved wooden tools and implements leaned against the structures. Stone rings for fires sat outside multiple dwellings, and I could see smoke wisps rising from some of them. Someone was actively living here. The doorways appeared to be 8 or 9 feet tall. My heart started pounding as the implications sank in. Movement on the screen caught my eye. Something was emerging from one of the larger structures. At first, my brain tried to rationalize it as a person in some kind of costume. But as the figure stepped fully into the clearing, that explanation crumbled. This was a massive creature covered in dark brown fur, walking on 2 legs with a slight forward hunch. It had to be at least 8 feet tall with shoulders broader than any human I had ever seen. My hands started shaking so badly I almost dropped the controller. I was watching a Bigfoot, a real Bigfoot, walking around its home like it was the most natural thing in the world. The creature walked to the fire pit and began arranging wood, moving with purpose and intelligence. This wasn't some dumb animal. This was something that understood tools and fire and community. Within minutes, more Bigfoot emerged from different structures. Some appeared to be juveniles, smaller and more playful than the adults. I watched as one large Bigfoot sat down with stone tools, methodically sharpening them. Another sorted through gathered plants, separating them into different piles. The juveniles chased each other around the clearing, their play looking remarkably similar to human children. The village was fully active, an organized community going about their daily morning routine. I watched for several more minutes, completely transfixed. Every documentary I had ever seen, every skeptical argument I had ever heard, all of it evaporated. Bigfoot was real. They lived in communities. They had culture and society and families. And I was watching it all unfold on my drone's camera screen. The battery warning pulled me back to reality. 20% remaining. I needed to bring the drone back immediately or risk losing it. I carefully flew it back over the forest canopy, away from the village. The Bigfoot below didn't seem to notice the small aircraft humming high above them. They were too far away, too focused on their morning tasks. I landed the drone safely back at my truck and just sat there for 30 minutes, trying to process what I had just witnessed. My mind kept circling back to the footage. It was all there on the memory card, crystal clear, undeniable. I had proof that Bigfoot existed, real, actual proof. Not some blurry photo or questionable footprint cast. High-definition video of an entire Bigfoot community living their lives. I reviewed the footage 3 times right there in the truck. Each viewing made it more real and more terrifying. These creatures were enormous, they were intelligent, and they lived just 2 miles from where people occasionally drove and hiked. How had they stayed hidden for so long? How many other villages like this existed in the vast wilderness of the Pacific Northwest? I made a decision that would change everything. I had to go back. I had to see this up close, with my own eyes, not through a camera screen. I needed to document this properly, to capture images that would make the scientific community take notice. The drone footage was good, but photographs from the ground would be irrefutable evidence. I drove home barely able to focus on the road. Sleep was impossible that night. I kept replaying the footage, planning my return trip. I told my wife I was going back to the same area for more photography work. She didn't ask many questions. I often spent full days out in the wilderness chasing the perfect shot. I woke up before dawn and packed my hiking backpack with everything I might need. The drone went in, along with 2 DSLR cameras equipped with telephoto lenses and extra batteries for everything. I packed water, energy bars, a basic first aid kit, and my phone for GPS navigation. I spent an hour studying the drone footage, memorizing landmarks and the route to the village. By my calculations, it was roughly a 2-mile hike through dense forest from where I had parked. I arrived at the same logging road turnout by 7 in the morning. The morning mist still hung heavy in the forest, reducing visibility and making everything feel somehow more ominous. I shouldered my pack, checked my compass and GPS one more time, and headed into the trees. The forest was eerily quiet again. No birds, no small animals rustling in the underbrush. Just an oppressive silence that made every footstep seem too loud. I followed landmarks I had memorized from the drone footage, using my compass and phone GPS to navigate through the thick underbrush. The terrain was rough, all steep slopes and dense vegetation that grabbed at my clothes and pack. After about an hour of difficult hiking, I started seeing signs that made my blood run cold. Branches broken at unusual heights, well above where a human could reach. Massive footprints in the soft mud near a small stream, each one easily 18 inches long and showing clear toe marks. A tree with deep scratch marks carved into its bark about 9 feet up the trunk. I was getting close to their territory. The Bigfoot had marked this area as theirs. I heard sounds ahead, voices, but not human voices. Low, rumbling vocalizations punctuated by higher-pitched calls. The crackle of a fire, movement through the underbrush. I dropped to a crouch and moved slowly, carefully forward. My heart hammered so hard I worried they would hear it. I reached the edge of the clearing and hid behind a large fallen log. The village spread out before me, somehow even more impressive from ground level than it had been from the drone footage. Several Bigfoot were visible in the clearing. 3 adults and 2 juveniles that I could count immediately. They moved with a casual confidence that said they felt completely safe here, completely at home. I carefully set up one of my cameras with the long telephoto lens and started taking photographs. The motor drive clicked softly as I captured dozens of clear shots over the next 20 minutes. One Bigfoot was weaving what looked like a basket from plant fibers. Another scraped at a large animal hide stretched on a wooden frame. The juveniles wrestled and played near the fire pit. The normalcy of it all was surreal. These weren't monsters. They were a family, a community, just trying to live their lives in peace. I was so focused on watching through the camera lens that I didn't notice the Bigfoot approaching from behind. A shadow fell over me. I turned around slowly and found myself staring up at a massive male Bigfoot standing just 10 feet away. He was even bigger up close, easily 8.5 feet tall with muscles that bulged under dark brown fur. His eyes were intelligent and curious, not aggressive. He tilted his head slightly, studying me the way I had been studying his family. I froze completely. My heart felt like it would explode. This was it. I was going to die in this forest and nobody would ever find my body. The Bigfoot made a low rumbling vocalization that I felt in my chest. It wasn't aggressive, more like he was calling to the others. Within a minute, 3 more Bigfoot emerged from the forest around me. I was surrounded, completely cut off from any escape route. But the attack I expected never came. Instead, one of them reached down slowly and took the camera from my hands. Not roughly, not aggressively, just firmly. Another picked up my backpack while the male who had found me gestured for me to stand up and follow. I had no choice. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely walk, but I followed them into the clearing. The other Bigfoot in the village stopped their activities and gathered around to stare. I felt like an exotic animal in a zoo. Everyone was looking, but nobody seemed hostile. A female Bigfoot brought over a hollowed log filled with water and offered it to me. I was so shocked I almost didn't take it, but my mouth was bone dry from fear. I drank. The water was cold and clean. The Bigfoot gestured for me to sit by the fire pit. One brought over roasted roots and some kind of dried meat on a bark plate. They were treating me like a curious guest, not like prey or a threat. I was terrified, but also fascinated. This wasn't how I thought this would go. I had expected to hide, take photos, and leave. Instead, I was sitting in the middle of a Bigfoot village being offered food. I tried to communicate through gestures, pointing at myself and then at them, trying to show I meant no harm. The Bigfoot seemed to understand but didn't try to communicate much back. They just watched me with those intelligent eyes, occasionally making soft vocalizations to each other that I couldn't decipher. I spent the next few hours just sitting there as the Bigfoot went about their business. They kept glancing over at me, keeping an eye on my movements, but they didn't restrict me. Not at first anyway. I watched as one Bigfoot carefully repaired a tear in a woven basket, his thick fingers working with surprising delicacy. Another ground some kind of plant material between two flat rocks, creating a paste that smelled medicinal and earthy. The juveniles had stopped playing and were watching me with open curiosity, though the adults kept them at a distance. The female who had offered me water earlier approached again, this time carrying what looked like a wooden comb. She gestured at my hair, which was probably a mess after hiking through the forest. When I didn't understand, she mimed combing motions. I nodded, uncertain, but not wanting to offend. She sat beside me and began gently working through the tangles in my hair. Her touch was surprisingly gentle for such large hands. The other Bigfoot watched this interaction with what seemed like approval. I started to relax slightly, thinking maybe they would let me leave once they satisfied their curiosity. Maybe this was just a strange encounter that would end with them escorting me out of their territory with a warning to never return. That illusion shattered completely when I tried to stand up to retrieve my backpack. A large Bigfoot gently but firmly pushed me back down. The message was clear. I could sit, I could eat, I could watch, but I couldn't leave. The friendly atmosphere suddenly felt oppressive. I asked through gestures for my cameras and drone back. The Bigfoot just shook their heads. One made a gesture like slashing across his throat. Universal meaning, no, not happening. My equipment was gone and I wasn't getting it back. My backpack was sitting near one of the structures. I could see it clearly. When I tried to approach it, multiple Bigfoot blocked my way. They weren't aggressive, but they were immovable. Finally, they allowed me to open the backpack while they watched carefully. All my camera equipment was gone. The drone was missing. Both DSLR cameras had been removed. Even my phone was gone. Only my water bottle, snacks, and first aid kit remained. The panic really set in then. They had systematically removed everything that could document their existence or help me communicate with the outside world. This wasn't random, this was deliberate. They understood what cameras and phones were. They knew what those devices could do. And they had taken them to protect themselves. The implications were terrifying. These creatures weren't just intelligent, they were strategic. They had dealt with humans before. As the sun began to set, the Bigfoot gestured for me to enter one of the smaller structures. Inside, it was actually quite comfortable, lined with furs and dried grass that created a soft, sleeping surface. But there was no door, and I could see a Bigfoot sitting outside, clearly standing guard. They weren't letting me go anywhere. I lay awake most of that first night, terrified and confused. I could hear the Bigfoot moving around outside, making their low vocalizations to each other. What did they want with me? Why were they keeping me here? Would anyone ever find me? I had told my wife I would be back by evening. She would report me missing soon. But the forest was vast and the village location was nearly impossible to find. Even if search teams came out, they would never think to look 2 miles into trackless wilderness. Morning came, and the guard Bigfoot brought me food and water, fresh berries, more roasted roots, some kind of nut paste. I ate because I was hungry, and because refusing might offend them. I spent that day observing their routine from my position by the fire pit. The Bigfoot had a clear social structure. Certain individuals seemed to be leaders, making decisions that others followed. Some Bigfoot were tool makers, others were gatherers, others maintained the structures. The juveniles helped with simple tasks, but mostly played and learned from the adults. It was a well-organized community with defined roles for everyone. I watched how they processed food, scraped hides, maintained their structures, and cared for their young. Their tool-making skills were impressive. They crafted sharp stone blades by striking rocks together with practiced precision. They carved wooden spears and fashioned woven containers from plant fibers. Every movement showed intelligence and planning. Some Bigfoot would leave through trails that led deeper into the forest, returning hours later with baskets full of gathered food. Others worked on repairing structures or processing the hides that dried on frames. Despite the fascinating anthropology of it all, my anxiety grew with each passing hour. How long would they keep me here? What was their plan? On the third day, I noticed increased activity and what seemed like urgency in their movements. The Bigfoot started taking down some of the smaller structures. I watched in amazement as they dismantled a dome structure in under an hour, working together with practiced efficiency. The materials were bundled and carried into the forest on the backs of the largest Bigfoot. That's when I understood how they stayed hidden. They were nomadic. This village wasn't permanent. They could pack everything up and relocate in a matter of hours, leaving behind only a clearing that would look natural within weeks. The clearing started to look less like a village and more like just another gap in the forest canopy. Within a few hours, half the structures were gone. That afternoon, all the Bigfoot gathered their remaining belongings and started moving. One took me by the arm and guided me along with the group. We hiked for about a mile through thick forest, steadily going uphill. My legs burned from the climb, but I had no choice but to keep pace. We reached a rocky outcropping with multiple cave entrances. This was their real home. The village had just been a temporary camp. The caves were extensive, connected by narrow passages that wound deep into the rock. Inside, the caves were set up like permanent dwellings. There were sleeping areas lined with furs, food storage areas filled with preserved meat and dried plants, and a large communal space with a fire pit. The smoke escaped through natural vents in the rock ceiling. I realized this cave system could easily house 50 or more Bigfoot. I saw evidence of long-term habitation everywhere. Carved symbols on the walls that might have been some form of writing or record-keeping. Organized storage areas where tools and supplies were carefully arranged. This wasn't just a shelter. This was a home that had been occupied for years, maybe decades. They led me deeper into the cave system to a smaller chamber. This would be my room. The entrance was too narrow for me to push past a Bigfoot guard. I was completely trapped. The surface village had been concerning. This was a nightmare. I could hear Bigfoot moving through the caves, their voices echoing off the stone. I spent hours in that dark chamber wondering what they wanted with me. Days passed in the caves. I lost track of exactly how many, maybe 4 or 5. The darkness was constant except for the torches and fire pits that provided dim, flickering light. The Bigfoot continued to be non-aggressive, bringing me food and water regularly on bark plates and in hollowed logs. Sometimes one would sit near my chamber entrance and just watch me for hours, tilting his head occasionally as if trying to understand what I was. I tried to ask through gestures why they were keeping me here. I pointed at myself, then at the cave entrance, miming walking away. They would shake their heads and sometimes make calming gestures, as if telling me to be patient. But they never answered my questions. They just maintained their routine, bringing food, watching me, and occasionally including me in their daily activities by gesturing for me to observe certain tasks. I started noticing patterns in their behavior. Certain Bigfoot came at the same times each day. One young male brought me water every morning. An older male checked on me in what felt like late afternoon. And then there was the elderly female who seemed particularly interested in me. She was different from the others, carrying herself with an authority that made even the largest males defer to her. This elderly female would bring special foods, things the others didn't eat, strange roots that tasted sweet, dried berries that were almost like candy, nuts that had been processed into a smooth paste. She brought me better water from a deeper source in the caves. She added extra furs to my sleeping area. At first, I thought maybe she was showing kindness, trying to make my captivity more comfortable. But her intensity made me increasingly uncomfortable. The way she looked at me wasn't kind, it was purposeful, calculating. She would sit in my chamber for long periods, chanting softly in a language I couldn't understand. She would trace symbols in the dirt floor with a stick, complex patterns that meant nothing to me but clearly held significance for her. Sometimes she would touch my forehead or my chest, closing her eyes as if sensing something. I felt like a specimen being prepared for something, though I had no idea what. About a week in, everything became horrifyingly clear. I was brought out to the main cave area where all the Bigfoot were gathered in a circle. They sat in what appeared to be a ceremonial arrangement, facing inward with precise spacing between each individual. Even the juveniles were present, sitting quietly behind the adults. The entire community was there. The older female who had been visiting me stood at the center. She wore what looked like a necklace made of bones and feathers, along with a headdress of braided plant fibers and what might have been animal teeth. Some kind of shaman or spiritual leader. They placed me in the center of the circle, sitting on the cave floor. I looked around at all the faces watching me, dozens of pairs of intelligent eyes reflecting the firelight. The shaman approached slowly, carrying a bowl that smoked with some kind of burning herb. The smell was pungent, making my eyes water. She walked around me 3 times, waving the smoke over my head and body with each pass. Then the Bigfoot began their vocalization. It started as a low rumble from the adult males, a sound I felt in my chest more than heard. The females joined in with higher-pitched calls, creating a harmony that was both beautiful and terrifying. The sound filled the cave, echoing off the stone walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. The juveniles added their voices, creating layers of sound that built into a rhythmic chant. The shaman approached me and placed both her large, fur-covered hands on my head. Her palms were warm and rough. She closed her eyes and began her own chant, different from the others, more melodic. I could feel the vibration through her hands into my skull. The other Bigfoot's chanting grew louder, faster, more intense. The smoke from the herb bowl grew thicker. I started feeling dizzy, though whether from fear or whatever was in that smoke, I couldn't tell. The ritual lasted about an hour, though time felt distorted in that smoke-filled cave with the constant chanting surrounding me. When it finally ended, the shaman removed her hands and stepped back. The chanting stopped abruptly, leaving a ringing silence. The Bigfoot looked at me with something like reverence now. They had transformed me from captive to something else, something important to their beliefs. Then they took me back to my chamber, 2 Bigfoot guiding me gently by the arms. I lay in my chamber afterward, my head spinning, trying to process what had happened. I realized with absolute horror what was going on. I wasn't being studied like some curious animal. I wasn't being kept as a pet or a trophy. This was spiritual. This was religious. They were keeping me for some shamanic or mystical purpose that I couldn't begin to understand. And that purpose was building towards something. Each ritual was a step in a process. But a process leading to what? I thought about all the stories of people who disappeared in national forests and were never found. The hundreds of cases every year where someone goes hiking and simply vanishes without a trace. No body, no evidence, nothing. How many of them had stumbled onto Bigfoot communities like this one? How many had been kept for rituals? How many had been subjected to ceremonies I couldn't understand, for purposes I didn't want to imagine? The thought made me sick with fear. I knew I had to try to escape, even if the odds were terrible. The alternative was staying here until whatever ritual they planned reached its completion. And I had no idea what that completion might involve. Maybe they would just let me go eventually. But I couldn't take that chance. The look in the shaman's eyes suggested something permanent was coming. Something final. I started observing the guard patterns more carefully, memorizing every detail of their routine. In what felt like early morning hours based on when they brought food, fewer Bigfoot moved through the passages. The cave was quietest then. The guard posted outside my chamber was always the same young male, and by that time he was usually drowsy, sitting with his back against the wall, head nodding forward. I studied the cave layout during the times they allowed me to walk to the communal area. I counted passages and memorized turns. Left from my chamber, then right at the first junction, straight through the main chamber, then left again toward the entrance. I repeated it in my mind hundreds of times until I could visualize the entire route, even in complete darkness. Each day, the ritual seemed to intensify. More ceremonies, more chanting. The shaman spent longer periods in my chamber, her attention becoming more focused and purposeful. Other Bigfoot began bringing offerings, leaving small carved stones and bundles of herbs near where I slept. I was being prepared for something. The clock was ticking and I was running out of time. I decided it had to be that night, or what I assumed was night in the perpetual darkness of the caves. The next morning, I suspected, would bring the final ritual. I could see it in how the Bigfoot were preparing. They cleaned the main chamber, arranged new ceremonial items, and the shaman made preparations that looked ominously final. I would make my escape attempt in the early hours before the final ceremony could take place. If I failed, the Bigfoot might kill me immediately. But staying meant accepting whatever fate they had planned, and I was certain that fate was worse than a quick death. I thought about my wife, about the life I had waiting for me back home. I thought about dying in this cave, my body never found, my fate never known. Those weren't acceptable options. I had to try. Even if the odds were impossibly bad, I had to try. That night, the cave was quieter than usual. The guard sat slumped against the wall outside my chamber, his breathing deep and regular, asleep or close to it. This was my chance. I moved as quietly as possible toward the entrance, holding my breath, praying the guard wouldn't wake. Every tiny sound felt amplified in the silence. I managed to slip past the guard's position and entered the narrow passage leading back toward the main cave area. My heart pounded so loud I was certain it would wake someone. The passages were dark, lit only by occasional dim firelight from deeper in the cave system. I had to feel my way along the rough stone walls, moving slowly to avoid making noise. I reached a junction and had to choose a direction. I tried to remember the route from when they brought me in days ago. Left felt right, if that makes any sense. I took the left passage and prayed it led toward an exit. I could hear Bigfoot sounds echoing through the caves, but couldn't tell how close they were. The acoustics made everything sound both near and far at the same time. I kept moving faster now, panic starting to override caution. I rounded a corner and saw firelight ahead. The main communal chamber. 2 Bigfoot sat by the fire, but they were facing away from me. I had to cross through this chamber to reach the exit passages. I waited in the shadows, watching for an opening. One of the Bigfoot stood up and walked deeper into the caves. Now was my chance. I stayed low and moved quickly across the chamber, keeping to the darkest shadows. I made it to the far passage entrance when behind me I heard one of the Bigfoot make a questioning vocalization. Had they seen me? I didn't wait to find out. I started running through the passage. Behind me, sudden loud vocalizations erupted. The alarm had been raised. I could hear Bigfoot moving, the sound of many footsteps echoing through the stone corridors. They were coming after me. I ran blindly through the darkness, hands scraping against rough cave walls, stumbling over uneven ground. I saw gray light ahead, the cave entrance. I sprinted toward it with everything I had, my lungs burning, my legs screaming. I burst out into pre-dawn forest light and didn't stop running. I had no idea which direction led back to the logging road. I just picked a direction and ran as hard as I could. I could hear Bigfoot emerging from the cave behind me, their heavy footsteps and angry vocalizations echoing from the cave mouth. I crashed through dense underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and skin, leaving scratches that burned. The Bigfoot were faster than me, much faster. Their long legs covered ground at an impossible pace. I could hear them getting closer with every second, their heavy footfalls shaking the ground, their deep vocalizations spurring me to move faster than I thought physically possible. The adrenaline turned everything sharp and clear. Every sense was heightened. I could smell the morning dew on the leaves, feel every stone and root under my feet, hear every snap of a twig behind me. My brain went into pure survival mode, calculating angles and distances without conscious thought. When a Bigfoot appeared ahead trying to cut me off, I saw it coming and changed direction before he could block my path. I pivoted hard left and found myself sliding down a muddy slope, barely keeping my feet under me, using trees to control my descent. A Bigfoot tried to grab me from the side, and I ducked under his reaching arm, feeling the brush of coarse fur against my cheek as his hand passed inches from my head. I scrambled away, using my smaller size and desperation to slip through gaps the Bigfoot couldn't follow. They were hunting me with terrifying intelligence and coordination. I could hear them calling to each other, their vocalizations clearly communicating my position and direction. They were coordinating their movements, trying to box me in. One would push me toward another waiting in ambush. When I dodged that trap, a third would come from a different angle. This wasn't animal pursuit. This was tactical hunting by intelligent beings who had done this before. My lungs burned, my legs screamed. I had been running at full sprint for what felt like forever, but was probably only minutes. I couldn't maintain this pace much longer. I spotted a massive fallen log with a hollow space underneath. The space created by roots that had torn from the ground when the tree fell. In absolute desperation, with Bigfoot closing in from 3 directions, I dove into that hollow gap. I crawled as far back as I could, squeezing into the tight space between the log and the forest floor. I grabbed handfuls of leaves and debris, covering myself as much as possible, trying to blend into the shadows and organic matter. I forced myself to lay completely still despite every instinct screaming at me to keep running. I tried to control my gasping breaths, breathing slowly through my nose despite my body's desperate need for oxygen. I heard Bigfoot converging on the area, their heavy footsteps getting closer. They were searching methodically, checking every possible hiding spot. I could hear them moving brush aside, looking behind trees, investigating every shadow and gap. One walked right past the log, so close that if I had reached out, I could have touched his leg. His massive foot landed just inches from my face, sending dirt and debris raining down on me. I could hear his breathing, deep and regular, smell the earthy scent of fur and forest that clung to him. I held absolutely still, not daring to even blink. My heart hammered so hard I was certain he could hear it. But he moved on, continuing his search in another direction. Other Bigfoot came close, searching the area around the log, but somehow none of them checked the hollow space underneath. Maybe it looked too small for a human. Maybe the shadow made it hard to see into. Whatever the reason, they missed me. Minutes crawled by, each one feeling like an hour. I stayed frozen in position, barely breathing, listening to the Bigfoot search around me. Gradually, the sounds moved farther away as they expanded their search pattern. I could hear them calling to each other, frustrated vocalizations that suggested they had lost the trail. But I didn't dare move yet. I stayed in that hollow for what must have been 20 or 30 minutes more, maybe longer, making absolutely certain they had moved on. When I finally dared to emerge, I was covered head to toe in mud, leaves, and rotting forest debris. I looked like something that had crawled out of a grave. My clothes were torn and filthy. My exposed skin was covered in scratches and bruises. But I was alive, and the forest around me was quiet. I tried to get my bearings, looking at the angle of the weak morning light filtering through the trees. I moved as quickly as possible while trying to stay quiet. Every sound made me freeze, expecting Bigfoot to appear. I pushed through exhaustion and fear, focused only on escape and survival. My body was running on pure adrenaline. My clothes were torn, my exposed skin covered in scratches and bruises. But none of that mattered. I just had to keep moving. After what felt like hours of difficult hiking through increasingly familiar terrain, I recognized a landmark. A distinctive dead tree split by lightning that I had passed on the way in. My truck was close. I could see it through the trees, sitting in the same spot at the old logging road turnout. I sprinted the last 100 yards, fumbling for my keys with shaking hands. I got in, started the engine, and half expected Bigfoot to emerge from the forest. But nothing moved in the trees. No pursuit appeared. I drove away as fast as I dared on the rough logging road, checking the mirror constantly. I didn't see anyone or anything following. I had made it out. I made it to the main highway and pulled into a gas station. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. I looked like I'd been through hell, scratched, bruised, covered in dried mud and forest debris. My eyes were wild with lingering fear. I had no phone, no cameras, no evidence except my own traumatized memory and the physical marks on my body. I bought water and food with the cash I still had in my pocket, then sat in the truck trying to process everything. I had been held captive by Bigfoot for over a week. I had witnessed their village, their caves, their rituals, and I had barely escaped with my life. But I had nothing to prove any of it had happened. No footage, no photographs, just my word against the skepticism of everyone who heard the story. When I got home, my wife was horrified by my condition. She had filed a missing persons report 3 days earlier. The police had been searching but hadn't found any trace of me. She wanted to call them immediately to tell them I was back. I refused, saying I just needed to rest. How could I tell her the truth? Nobody would believe it. They would think I had lost my mind or was making up stories. I told her I'd gotten lost hiking and survived in the wilderness. It was a partial truth. She accepted it, though I could tell she suspected there was more to the story. The police closed the missing persons case. Life slowly returned to normal on the surface. But nothing was normal anymore. I had nightmares for weeks. Every night I would wake up feeling trapped in those caves, hearing the rhythmic chanting echoing off stone walls, feeling the shaman's warm hands pressing down on my head. The fear was overwhelming and visceral. I would sit up gasping, drenched in sweat, convinced I was still trapped underground. My wife would wake up and try to comfort me, asking what the nightmares were about. I couldn't tell her. How could I explain that I dreamed about being held captive by creatures that supposedly don't exist? The scratches on my arms and legs healed, but I found myself staring at the scars they left behind. Physical proof that it had really happened, that I hadn't imagined the whole terrifying ordeal. Sometimes I would trace the scars with my fingers, remembering specific moments. This one from a branch during the chase. That one from crawling through the hollow under the log. Each scar was a memory of survival. I had been incredibly lucky to escape. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how many things had to go right for me to make it out. The guard had to fall asleep at exactly the right time. I had to navigate the dark passages without getting lost. I had to find that hollow log at the perfect moment. If any single element had gone differently, I would still be in those caves, or dead. Most likely dead once the Bigfoot caught me during the escape. If I had stayed, what would have happened to me? What was the final step in their ritual? The shaman had been building toward something specific. I could see it in her eyes, in the way the preparations intensified each day. Was I meant to be some kind of sacrifice? Or was it something else, something I couldn't even conceptualize because I didn't understand their beliefs or their worldview? I didn't want to know. I was glad I had escaped before finding out. But the not knowing haunted me almost as much as the knowing might have. I started researching missing persons cases in national forests, something I had never paid attention to before. The numbers were staggering. Hundreds of people disappear in wilderness areas every year. Most are eventually found, lost, or injured but alive. But a significant percentage simply vanish without a trace. No body, no evidence, no leads, just gone. How many of those disappearances were connected to Bigfoot encounters? How many people had stumbled onto villages or caves and never made it out? I found online forums where people shared their own Bigfoot encounters, stories dismissed as hoaxes or delusions by mainstream society. But reading through them, I saw patterns, people describing massive structures in remote areas, strange vocalizations in the night, the feeling of being watched, and occasionally stories from people who claimed to have been taken but escaped. Those stories were usually buried, downvoted, called crazy, but I read every word with growing horror. They described things eerily similar to what I had experienced. I think about that village constantly, about the Bigfoot going about their daily lives, unaware of how close they came to being exposed to the world. About the cave system hidden deep in the mountains where they've probably lived for generations, maybe centuries. About all the other people who might have stumbled onto their communities over the years and never made it out to tell anyone. About the equipment they took from me, my cameras and drone now hidden somewhere in those caves, proof that could have changed everything. The government knows about them. They have to. How could they not? Park rangers must have encountered evidence over the decades, footprints, structures, maybe even bodies of people who didn't escape. But there's clearly a conscious decision to keep it quiet, to let people think Bigfoot is just a myth perpetuated by hoaxers and attention seekers. Maybe it's to protect the Bigfoot, recognizing them as an endangered species that needs to be left alone. Maybe it's to protect tourists and hikers who might panic if they knew what was really out there in the deep wilderness. Or maybe it's something else entirely, some reason I can't understand. I've spent countless hours trying to find the location again on maps and satellite imagery. I've zoomed in on every section of national forest in that area, looking for landmarks I remember. The distinctive rock formations near the cave entrance, the pattern of the forest where the village had been. But 2 miles into trackless wilderness with nothing but vague landmarks to go on makes it nearly impossible. The cave system is hidden under rock outcroppings and tree cover. The clearing where the village was probably looks like natural forest again by now, the Bigfoot having moved on to establish their temporary camp elsewhere. Sometimes I consider going back, hiring a guide, getting better equipment, trying to find that cave system again, maybe bringing someone with me who would believe the story, who could witness it themselves. But then I remember the fear, the absolute terror of being trapped underground with creatures who could kill me with their bare hands if they wanted. The hopelessness of being kept against my will with no way to contact anyone. The horror of those rituals building toward something unknown. And I can't do it. I can't go back. The psychological scars run too deep. I'm sharing this story because people need to know the truth. Bigfoot is real. They exist. They live in organized communities with social structures and spiritual beliefs. They have culture and intelligence and capabilities we don't understand. And they're far more dangerous than the myth suggests, not because they're aggressive monsters, but because they can take you and nobody will ever find you. They understand enough about human technology to remove evidence. They're smart enough to stay hidden despite centuries of searching. And they have purposes for captives that I still don't fully understand. If you're hiking in remote wilderness and you see signs of their presence, trust your instincts and turn around immediately. Leave the area as fast as you can. Don't investigate. Don't try to get proof. Don't think you'll be the exception who makes contact peacefully. Broken branches high up on trees where nothing should reach. Massive footprints pressed deep into mud. The eerie silence that comes when all the birds stop singing and the squirrels go quiet. Those are warnings. Nature itself is trying to tell you that you're in their territory now. Don't ignore those warnings like I did. I see those signs sometimes now, even in forests closer to civilization. I go hiking with my wife, trying to reclaim some normalcy, trying to prove to myself that I'm not afraid of the woods anymore. But then I'll see a tree with scratch marks too high up. Or I'll notice that the forest has gone silent. And the fear comes rushing back. My heart starts pounding. My hands start shaking. I make excuses about needing to turn back, about being tired or the trail being too difficult. My wife thinks I've developed some kind of anxiety about hiking. She's partially right. But she doesn't know the real reason. I was lucky. I escaped. I got out alive with nothing worse than some scratches and psychological trauma. But my cameras and drone are still in that cave somewhere, along with clear evidence that could have proven everything. The Bigfoot knew exactly what they were doing when they took my equipment. They've stayed hidden this long because they understand the danger of exposure. They recognize cameras and phones. They know what those devices can do. They're not just animals operating on instinct. They're intelligent enough to recognize threats and systematically eliminate evidence that could reveal their existence. Every time I see a story about someone going missing in a national park, I wonder, did they encounter what I encountered? Did they stumble onto a village? Were they taken to the caves? Are they still alive somewhere underground, being prepared for rituals I can't understand? Or did they resist and were killed, their bodies hidden where they'll never be found? The not knowing is torture, but coming forward would mean explaining everything, and nobody would believe me without proof. Every time I hear skeptics laugh about Bigfoot being fake, about it all being hoaxes and misidentified bears, I want to grab them and tell them the truth. I want to describe the intelligence in those eyes, the complex tool making, the organized community structure, the spiritual practices, the systematic way they removed all my equipment. These aren't animals. These aren't primitive creatures stumbling through the forest. These are beings with culture and society who have simply chosen to remain hidden from the world that would destroy them if their existence was confirmed. So I'm putting this story out there. Maybe someone will believe it. Maybe it will help someone else recognize the signs and get out before it's too late. Maybe it will just be dismissed as fiction. But I know what I saw. I know what I experienced. And I know that somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, hidden in caves beneath the mountains, Bigfoot communities continue to exist in secret. The forest keeps its secrets well. But sometimes those secrets find you when you're not looking for them, and sometimes, if you're lucky, you live to tell about it. I'm one of the lucky ones. I got out. But I'll never forget what I saw in those 2 weeks, and I'll never stop looking over my shoulder, wondering if they're still looking for me, wondering if they'll come to finish what they started. That's my story. That's the truth about what happened when my drone footage exposed a massive Bigfoot village in a national forest. I went looking for beautiful waterfalls and found something far more terrifying. I found proof that we're not alone in these forests. And that proof cost me 2 weeks of my life, my peace of mind, and every piece of evidence that could have made people believe me. Believe it or don't. But if you're ever in those remote forests and you see signs of something that shouldn't exist, remember my story. Turn around. Leave. Don't make the mistake I made. Because once they have you, escaping is almost impossible. I was lucky. The next person might not be. For more interesting stories, check this out.